A quiet girl, an arrogant teacher, and a piano. What began as a cruel attempt to humiliate her turned into a moment that silenced the entire classroom and shattered the proud egos. You won't believe how she turned the tables, not with words, but with music. The gates of Willow Ridge Academy opened wide under the morning sun, showcasing the grandeur of one of Virginia's most prestigious high schools. Expensive cars rolled into the parking lot, where groups of students stepped out, dressed in stylish clothes, carrying designer bags, and exuding confidence. Laughter echoed across the marble-paved courtyard, where those born into privilege belonged as naturally as breathing. A little further, Alyssa Carter quietly stepped off the old school bus, her slightly worn-out sneakers gently touching the sidewalk. No one turned to look at her. No one welcomed her. At Willow Ridge, Alyssa was not a name that stood out. She didn't have her own car, expensive clothes, or perfectly styled hair like the other girls. She didn't belong to the world of the wealthy, and they didn't bother hiding it. Alyssa tightened the straps of her backpack and walked quickly past groups of chatting friends. She didn't want attention, but that was never easy. Madison Harrington made sure she was always mentioned in the worst way. Madison Harrington, with her silky blonde hair and sharp blue eyes, was the epitome of perfection in the eyes of teachers and parents. She was not only beautiful but also the daughter of a powerful family with influence in both politics and finance. For Madison, everything could be bought: power, fame, and even control over others. And Alyssa? She was a stain in Madison's glamorous picture. "Look, it's the scholarship girl." Madison's voice rang out from afar as Alyssa passed through the courtyard. "I wonder if she has enough money for breakfast today." One of Madison's friends snickered. "I bet she doesn't, but maybe she'll beg for food at the church like she always does." Alyssa bit her lip but didn't stop. She was used to these taunts. At Willow Ridge, everything revolved around money. Those without it? They were invisible. But being ignored was sometimes better than being targeted by Madison. After each long day at school, Alyssa didn't return to a mansion or a fancy restaurant like her classmates. She went back to her small apartment, where her mother, Monica Carter, was still working her shift at the hospital. Their apartment wasn't big, but it was always warm. Monica, despite being exhausted from long hours, always tried to spend time with her daughter. But Alyssa knew her mother had sacrificed so much. "How was school today, sweetheart?" Monica asked, forcing a smile, even though her eyes were darkened from lack of sleep. "Same as usual, Mom." Alyssa replied briefly, hiding the frustration of a long day of being looked down upon. But there was one thing that made Alyssa different. One thing that Madison and people like her could never take away: music. Since she was a little girl, Alyssa had loved the sound of the piano. While other kids played with dolls or watched cartoons, she would sit for hours at the local church's old piano, letting her tiny fingers glide over the worn keys. She had no teacher, no new music books, but that didn't stop her from learning. She listened to Debussy, Beethoven, and Chopin on her old phone and tried to play them with her own hands. She practiced with all her heart, borrowing music books from the library and studying every note. She didn't just play the piano, she lived in music. But at Willow Ridge, her dream had no place. Piano was a subject for the elite. Kids like Madison had the best teachers hired by their parents, practicing on expensive grand pianos. And Alyssa, she could only quietly play in the corner of the church when no one was around. And she had never dared to play in front of others. But all of that was about to change, in just one moment. That day, Richard Grayson, the school's music teacher, announced that students would be required to perform an impromptu piano piece during class. "I want to see you express emotion through music, not just play pieces you've memorized." His voice was dry and stern. Madison, with her smug look, would obviously be the center of attention. She had been playing piano since she was 3 and had performed at major school events. Alyssa? She didn't want to participate, but Mr. Grayson didn't let her escape. Alyssa Carter, would you like to give it a try? Or are you just used to listening to music through headphones? The whole class gasped and laughed. Madison sneered, folding her arms and looking at Alyssa with a challenging glare. Alyssa felt a chill run down her spine. Mr. Grayson wanted to humiliate her. Madison wanted to see her fail. Alyssa could refuse. She could shake her head and sit still, letting everything pass by like usual. But a part of her wouldn't allow that. She thought of the long nights spent practicing in silence, of the dreams she had never dared to voice. Then she stood up. All eyes turned to her. Alyssa Carter walked to the piano, and for the first time in her life, she decided to let the world know about her talent. Alyssa stood there, her hand lightly clutching the edge of her uniform, her breath shallow but hurried as every eye in the class fixed on her. The air thickened with anticipation, not the eager kind, but the cruel kind. Everyone wanted to see her stumble, to see her fail, to see her become the joke in a room full of people who had never had to struggle for an opportunity. And at the center of it all, Richard Grayson was watching her with a smile full of implications. Richard Grayson was a man in his 50s, thin but with gestures that exuded authority, the kind of power built over years of tapping a ruler on the desk without ever needing to raise his voice. He was a longtime music teacher who had taught at Willowridge Academy for over 2 decades, and his reputation among the upper-class parents had never wavered. The wealthy parents liked him. They liked the way he nurtured kids with potential, the students whose families could afford expensive private lessons, the kids who were already privileged and just needed a little push to reach the top. He held lavish performances, internal competitions, where the chosen faces would shine, and those who didn't meet his standards would forever remain silent spectators in the back rows. And to Mr. Grayson, Alyssa Carter didn't belong on that stage. He had never truly cared for students like her, the kids without family backing, without formal music training, without private tutors guiding each note. In his eyes, Alyssa was a faint name on the class roster, just a student who kept good enough grades to avoid being dropped, but nothing worth his attention. And so, when he saw her sitting there, silent amid the giggles of Madison and her friends, an idea suddenly sparked in his mind. A lesson. A lesson to remind Alyssa Carter that she had no place here. Mr. Grayson slowly walked to the center of the class, the sound of his leather shoes clicking on the wooden floor, a noise that made the room even more silent. Then, in a prolonged tone, he spoke. "Alyssa Carter, perhaps you'd like to give it a try? Or are you just used to listening to music through headphones?" His words weren't loud, but they were sharp, like a well-honed blade, and immediately the class erupted in laughter. Madison smirked, crossing her arms, while others turned to whisper, exchanging mocking glances. A few even covered their mouths, as if holding in their laughter at something far too amusing. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just asking a student to stand and perform, he was calling out someone who, in his view, had no chance of succeeding. He was creating a situation he knew would make Alyssa uncomfortable, would undermine her confidence in front of her peers, would show her that some doors were never meant to open for people like her. Alyssa felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She didn't want to step up. She didn't want to become the entertainment for people like Madison, didn't want to let Mr. Grayson get what he wanted. She knew she could refuse. She could shake her head, say she didn't want to play, say she wasn't good at the piano, say she hadn't prepared. Surely he wouldn't force her. Though he had power, he couldn't make a student perform before the class. But if she did that, If she stayed seated, if she refused, it would become the truth. The laughter, the scornful looks, all of it would affirm that Alyssa Carter was nothing special, that she didn't deserve music, that she was just a poor girl who knew nothing but to dream. She clenched her fist. Then, in a brief but decisive moment, she looked up. She stared straight into Mr. Grayson's eyes, those eyes still gleaming with expectation, waiting to see her shake her head, waiting to see her admit she was too scared. But instead, Alyssa took a deep breath and slowly stood up. The room seemed to shrink as the 15-year-old girl walked to the center of the room, each step heavy as though a ton of weight were pulling her down. All eyes remained locked on her, but this time, it wasn't just mockery, it was also a certain curiosity. Madison squinted, watching Alyssa's every move, as though not believing this girl dared to accept the challenge. Mr. Grayson raised an eyebrow, looking slightly surprised, but quickly hid the expression with a small smile. Alyssa walked to the grand piano in the center of the room, the wooden chair cold beneath her as she sat down. Her hands rested on the keys. The laughter had stopped, but the air still hung heavy with expectation. She knew she couldn't afford to make a mistake. She knew that if she played clumsily, if she revealed even a hint of hesitation, no one would ever let her forget it. Mr. Grayson crossed his arms and nodded, a challenge in his eyes. "Go ahead, Carter. We're all waiting." Alyssa closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and when she opened them, her fingers began to move. A note rang out, a note, then two. Softly, gently, like a breeze passing over the driest, heaviest things. The room held its breath. The first sound echoed, a soft low note like a drop of water falling onto a still pond. But before it could fully resonate, a muffled giggle broke out somewhere in the classroom, tearing apart the fragile atmosphere Alyssa was trying to create. She felt it immediately, a heavy, invisible pressure on her chest, as if every nerve in her body had suddenly tightened. Eyes, dozens of them, were staring at her, not with curiosity or expectation, but with mockery. From the corner of the room, Madison tossed her hair back, crossed her legs in a practiced manner, and turned to her friends with a scornful sneer. She didn't need to say anything. Just that raised eyebrow was enough to make the group burst into laughter. "Well, sounds promising," a girl's voice chimed in, laced with laughter. "She probably hasn't even touched a real piano before," another one whispered, but loud enough for Alyssa to hear. Alyssa didn't need to turn around to know who was saying what. She could feel every glance, every disdainful look that swept over her like razor-sharp blades. Some were whispering to each other, others smirking, but they were all waiting for her to fail. And at the center of it all stood Mr. Grayson, his expression betraying nothing but indifference. He didn't laugh, but the way he folded his arms, tilted his head ever so slightly, spoke volumes. This wasn't a music test. It was a trial he was sure Alyssa would fail. He had seen kids like her before. Outsiders, dreamers crushed by reality. Alyssa was just another one of them. And he didn't need to say it out loud to be sure she wouldn't change anything. Alyssa blinked, but not to focus. She was trying to push back the old memories that were flooding in. She remembered the first time she touched the keys of the old church piano. Its keys were worn, some chipped, but to her it was more beautiful than all the expensive pianos Madison and the others had. She remembered the late nights when her mother came home after a long shift, still trying to smile, even though her eyes were tired beyond belief. She had worked tirelessly, not to buy Alyssa a shiny piano or a new dress like the other girls had, but just to make sure there was food on the table and a roof over their heads. She remembered the rejections, the scholarships she applied for but never received, The pitiful advice from her old teachers. Alyssa, you should focus on something more practical, instead of chasing a distant dream like music. All of it once made her want to give up. And maybe, if this had been another time, another place, another day, she would have lowered her head, sat back down, and let Madison and Mr. Grayson have what they wanted. But today, something had changed. Alyssa took a deep breath, her fingers still on the keys, but this time, she didn't tremble. She could lift her head, look Madison in the eye, look at those who were waiting for her to fail, and say she didn't want to play. She could turn to Mr. Grayson, pretend to be confused, pretend not to know how to play, so he could sneer, shake his head, and move on to another student. She could take the easy way out, but she didn't. She didn't know what had changed. Maybe it was the long nights of silent practice. Maybe it was her mother's words. Maybe it was the pain that had been lingering too long. But now, she didn't want to run anymore. She didn't need to prove anything to Mr. Grayson. She didn't need to make Madison change her mind about her. But she needed to prove to herself that she wasn't as small as they wanted her to believe. She relaxed her shoulders, her fingers lightly gliding over the keys, and this time, when she played the first notes, nothing could stop her anymore. The classroom gradually fell silent. The mocking laughter that had once filled the air seemed swallowed by the first notes of Claire de Lune Alyssa was playing. Mr. Grayson, still standing with his arms folded, suddenly stopped, his eyes narrowing as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Madison, who had been lounging against the desk with a carefree attitude, now sat up straight, her brows furrowed in a way she had never done before. The other students, the ones who had scoffed when Alyssa's name was called, now fell silent. Because they hadn't expected this. They had been waiting for awkwardness, wrong notes, the trembling of each key. They had expected a spectacle. But instead, they heard only pure, emotional music that silenced them all. Alyssa didn't look at anyone. She just closed her eyes and let the music lead her, because she knew that this was the moment when she had to let the world see who she truly was. The sound of the piano echoed, at first as light as a breath, but each note seemed to tear through the heavy air in the classroom. Alyssa felt the shift, a moment when no one dared to laugh, no one dared to whisper, but she knew this was just the beginning. She took a deep breath, her fingers lightly grazing the keys, each finger quietly searching for certainty. But just then, a sudden wave of fear surged within her. She almost got up to leave. It felt as though an invisible force was pulling her away from her seat, as if she stood up now, she could escape the judgment, escape the eyes waiting for her to make a mistake, escape Madison and Mr. Grayson, those who never wished her success. She could leave, but then, like a breeze passing through her mind, her mother's voice appeared, gentle yet firm. You don't need to prove anything, but never let anyone look down on you. Those words were like a small light in the dark room, yet they were the only thing that helped her move forward. Alyssa opened her eyes. She didn't leave. She stayed. Madison propped her elbows on the desk, tilting her head arrogantly, her sharp green eyes fixed on Alyssa. She didn't say anything, but the raised eyebrow and half smile said it all. Go ahead, show us how bad you are. The others in the class were the same. Some still whispered, others simply crossed their arms, leaning back in their chairs, ready to laugh if Alyssa made a mistake. Then her gaze met Mr. Grayson's. He stood there, no longer smiling as before, but now wearing an expression that Alyssa couldn't read. It wasn't exactly amusement, but it wasn't entirely surprise either. It was like a hunter observing its prey, a calm waiting, because he was sure he knew what would happen next. He was certain she would fail. Alyssa felt her heart race, not because of fear, but because she was standing at the most important crossroads of her life. If she played, she would step beyond it. If she failed, she would forever be bound by their mockery, forever the girl who didn't belong in this world, and she wouldn't let that happen. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and then she began to play. The first note sounded, followed by a sudden silence so deep that Alyssa herself felt as though she had stepped into another space. This space no longer contained mocking laughter, no longer filled with whispers, no longer any sound except the piano, gradually enveloping everything. The soft yet powerful melody of Claire de Lune spread, each note weaving a shimmering picture in the room that had once been cold and rigid. Madison stopped laughing. She sat up straight, her eyes wide open, no longer with the teasing excitement she had before. The other students, who had expected a clumsy performance, could only sit still. Mr. Grayson, the man who had always maintained a calm expression, furrowed his brow slightly, a tiny reaction that couldn't hide his confusion. Because they hadn't expected this. They thought Alyssa would tremble. They thought she would hit the wrong note, that she would stop, that she would be afraid. But all they got was a performance that left them speechless. Alyssa didn't need to look at anyone. She closed her eyes and let the music guide her. She could no longer hear the whispers, no longer feel the scrutinizing eyes. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel small. She had chosen to stay. She had chosen to step onto the stage. And now, no one would pull her down. Music filled the room like a gentle yet powerful wave, sweeping away the mocking laughter and scornful gazes in the blink of an eye. As the first notes of Claire de Lune sounded, the entire class seemed to hold its breath. The frowns that had waited for a quick failure transformed into looks of astonishment. The piano's sound was gentle and smooth, yet not weak. In fact, it carried an invisible strength, a steady determination, as if each note was telling the story of a long, challenging journey. Alyssa no longer trembled. Her fingers began to glide across the keys with growing confidence, as if this music had always been inside her, just waiting for this moment to reveal itself to the world. At first, she focused solely on each key, listening to the familiar rhythm she had taught herself during long, quiet days. But as the music flowed on, she no longer thought about what was happening around her. She no longer cared about Madison or those who had mocked her. She no longer cared about Mr. Grayson or his indifferent skepticism. All that was left was the music. The room fell into absolute silence. Some students straightened up in their seats as though they no longer dared to show indifference. Madison, who had been lounging in her seat with a smug look, waiting for a failure, was now leaning forward with her elbows on the desk, her eyes fixed on every movement of Alyssa, her earlier mockery completely gone. Her friends, those who had always snickered after every one of Madison's words, were now silent too. Their silence wasn't just from surprise, but because they had been swept into the music that was overtaking the room. A music that could not be ignored or belittled. But the biggest change wasn't among the students. It was in Mr. Grayson. At first, he stood with his arms crossed, eyes filled with expectancy, the patience of a teacher used to determining who had potential and who would never reach the top. But after just a few notes, the smugness in his eyes vanished. He squinted, staring at the girl sitting before the piano, his face showing a hint of confusion. Because in that moment, he knew he had been wrong. He had thought Alyssa would make a mistake. He had been certain she wouldn't be able to play such a complex piece perfectly. But what he was hearing was music so refined and emotional that even the proudest would fall silent. There was no doubt now. Alyssa didn't just play the piano. She played with her soul, with everything she had. She had practiced in the dark, played alone in empty rooms, let the notes become her companions during the loneliest of days. Without a private tutor, without formal lessons, she had taught herself through endless nights. And now, all of that was embodied in every melody she played. She didn't need to look at anyone, nor did she need anyone's approval. She knew she was right to step up to that piano, knowing she was no longer the shy girl who had been mocked in the corner of the class. She was a real pianist. Alyssa continued playing, and each note wrapped everyone in its embrace, pulling them into a space from which no one could escape. Madison gripped the edge of the desk, her face no longer holding its fake composure. She glanced around, as if searching for support from her friends, but no one looked back at her. They were all absorbed in the music, having completely forgotten that they had laughed at the one playing just moments before. The notes continued to echo, each melody painting the air like a picture drawn with light and emotion. Alyssa no longer worried about being judged, she simply played, because it was the one thing she knew she was born to do. She felt a release. Everything she had held in, all the pain, all the pressure she had carried for so many years, was now being expressed through the keys. It wasn't just a piece of music. It was her strongest declaration. No one could deny her anymore. Mr. Grayson still stood there, but his gaze had changed. His arms, once crossed in front of his chest, had fallen loosely to his sides, and his face no longer held the usual calm expression. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew that what he had just witnessed had changed his thinking forever. Alyssa hadn't failed. She had done what no one in that room expected. She had conquered them. She had stepped out of the shadow they had placed over her. And when the final note rang out, when the sound lingered and slowly faded like a calm lake after a breeze, the room remained utterly still. No one spoke, no one moved, as if they were all still trying to process what had just happened. Alyssa opened her eyes. She looked down at the keys, her breath still a little short, but her heart no longer raced with fear. She had done it. She had let the music speak for her, and in that moment she knew that everything had changed forever. A long moment, endless as it seemed, passed as the last note faded, leaving a silence so deep that Alyssa could almost hear her own heartbeat echoing in the space. She remained seated, her hand gently resting on the piano keys, her breath steady but deeper than usual. A strange wave of emotion rose within her, neither fear nor relief, but something stronger, a realization that she had just done what no one in that room thought possible. She had made their entire world go silent. The students in the class, who had moments ago been laughing and waiting for her to fail, now sat motionless. A few were still in a daze, as if trying to comprehend what had just happened. The faces that had once been filled with mockery were now replaced with confusion, exchanged glances, as though they could not believe their own ears. There were no more whispers or derisive snickers, no more condescending stares or arrogant murmurs. Alyssa slowly lifted her gaze. She locked eyes with Madison Harrington. The girl, who had always maintained an air of perfection, who had never allowed herself to appear less than anyone else, now sat motionless with wide-open eyes. No more haughty smiles, no more mocking smirks, only deep astonishment. Madison couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. What had she expected? A clumsy performance. An embarrassed Alyssa getting up from the piano, head lowered in shame as the class erupted in mockery. She had been sure that Alyssa would do nothing more than become a source of amusement for them all, but instead she was forced to sit there, stunned by a performance so magnificent that she couldn't react immediately. And what irritated Madison the most wasn't the surprise. It was the truth. The truth that Alyssa Carter was not the weakling she had always believed her to be. The truth that the girl didn't need designer clothes or a prestigious background to be outstanding. The truth that there was something in Alyssa that money could never buy. The confusion in Madison's eyes slowly morphed into a simmering anger, a bitterness she didn't want to admit. She gripped the edge of the desk lightly, but said nothing, dared not say anything, because she knew that any words now would be meaningless. But Madison wasn't the only one losing her confidence. Alyssa looked toward Mr. Grayson. The man still stood there, but his face no longer held the smug, indifferent expression it once had. If he had looked at her earlier with anticipation for her failure, now his gaze reflected something else, an uncontainable shock. He didn't say a word, just stared at Alyssa as if trying to see her clearly for the first time. Perhaps, over the years of teaching, he had become too accustomed to classifying students, too used to determining who deserved to stand on stage and who should remain in the audience. But in this moment he knew that everything he had ever believed had been turned upside down. Alyssa Carter was not an insignificant student with nothing special to offer. She didn't just know how to play the piano. She didn't just have talent. She had a musical soul that no one could deny, and that was something he had never anticipated. The room remained silent. Alyssa could feel her fingers still trembling lightly after finishing the piece, but not from fear or anxiety, but from something much stronger. She knew she had touched something deeper than a test or an impromptu performance. She had forced them to see her in a different way. A single clap broke the silence from the back of the room. At first, it was just a solitary, soft but firm clap. Then another, and soon the whole class erupted in applause, filling the silence that had lingered in those few seconds. A few students stood up, clapping with excitement they hadn't expected. Some were still stunned, but they slowly joined in the growing round of applause. Alyssa looked around, unable to believe what she was seeing. The people who had mocked her, the ones who had hoped she would fail, were now clapping for her. Not because they pitied her, not because they felt guilty, but because they couldn't deny her. Mr. Grayson still stood there, but he didn't clap. He couldn't, because doing so would have been an admission that he had been completely wrong. He just slowly inhaled deeply, his eyes fixed on Alyssa, as if reassessing the entirety of who she was. Madison turned away, unable to bear witnessing this any longer. She bit her lip, silently clenched her fists under her coat, but said nothing, because for the first time in her life, she was the one being pushed aside. Alyssa stood up, feeling her heartbeat still echoing in her chest. But this time, it was not the heartbeat of anxiety or fear, but the heartbeat of a victory she didn't need anyone to give her. She had made their world go silent. She had let her music speak. And she knew that from this day forward, they would never look at her the same way again. The final notes of the piano echoed and then faded away, like the moon sinking beneath the horizon. The room remained so silent that Alyssa could hear her own breath, could feel the warmth still lingering on her fingertips from the piano keys. She didn't hurry to leave her seat, nor did she seek anyone's gaze. She simply allowed this moment to pass, like a soft breeze gently yet profoundly sinking into the cracks of the souls that had once doubted her. The atmosphere in the classroom was thick, as if compressed by an invisible pressure. All eyes were still fixed on the podium, where Mr. Grayson stood motionless, his gaze locked on Alyssa as though he couldn't believe what had just happened. In the middle of a room full of students whom he once thought he understood, among faces he had become accustomed to categorizing as potential, and those who should stay on the periphery, he realized that his biases had been wrong. His fingers twitched slightly as if he wanted to make a gesture but then stopped. His lips pressed tightly together, his face torn between acknowledgement and the stubborn ego he had held on to for so many years. But the whole class's eyes were still on him. No one spoke, but everyone was waiting. No one laughed at Alyssa anymore. No one whispered with disdain. They had seen what they never imagined. Someone they considered insignificant had done what they could not even conceive. And now, they wanted to know how Mr. Grayson would respond. He took a deep breath, as though swallowing something difficult. Then, in a slow voice filled with inner conflict, he said, "I didn't expect this. You did well." The words echoed in the quiet space, but they didn't carry a generous or voluntary praise. Instead, it was reluctant, a recognition from someone who didn't want to admit, but couldn't deny the reality. A few students exchanged glances. Some furrowed their brows, as if waiting for him to say more, but he didn't continue. Although he had acknowledged Alyssa's talent, it was clear that this wasn't the compliment he wanted to give her. It was a forced recognition, not genuine respect. Alyssa felt it immediately. She didn't expect praise from him, nor did she want hollow compliments or empty words. She knew that if it weren't for the eyes of the class on him, he would never have spoken these words. But that didn't matter, because she didn't need his acknowledgement to know her own worth. Alyssa took a deep breath, then slowly stood up, her gaze unwavering as she looked straight into his eyes. She didn't lower her head, nor did she show gratitude for his reluctant praise. Instead, her voice rang out, clear and sharp, each word like a knife cutting through the shield of power that Mr. Grayson had always surrounded himself with. Everyone has talent. What matters is whether you have the eyes to see it. The room seemed to tremble. It wasn't the volume of her voice that caused the stir, but the weight of every word she spoke. No one moved. No one breathed heavily. Madison, who had been sitting still from start to finish, quickly turned her head, her eyes wide as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. Her friends remained silent, no one daring to mock or interrupt, because they knew that statement wasn't just aimed at Mr. Grayson. It was aimed at everyone who had ever looked down on Alyssa. Everyone who thought they had the right to determine someone's worth based only on what they believed was right. The atmosphere in the classroom seemed to freeze for a few seconds, but then, something no one expected happened. A round of applause erupted. But this time, it wasn't for the performance. It was for her words. Some students, even those who had once distanced themselves from Alyssa, began to nod, exchanging glances as if they had just realized something they had missed before. A few quietly smiled, not with pity but with genuine respect. A boy sitting near the back of the class, someone Alyssa never thought would pay attention to her, muttered softly, "She's right." A girl, who had always followed Madison but never spoke up, nodded slightly, her expression as if she were reflecting on things she had never noticed before. The change wasn't obvious, but it was real. It showed in the way some students started to look at Alyssa differently, in the way they no longer saw her as an outsider. It showed in the way they looked at Mr. Grayson, no longer with the unquestioning trust they once had for their teacher, but with eyes full of consideration. And most importantly, it showed in Alyssa herself. She no longer felt like someone who had to seek validation. She no longer felt like an outsider in this world. She knew that she had changed something. Even if just a little, even if just for a moment, she had made them reconsider. And that was worth more than any praise. Mr. Grayson said nothing more. He stared at Alyssa for a long moment, then took a deep breath, as though battling his own thoughts. But in the end, he didn't argue, because he couldn't. Alyssa had let her music speak. And now she had let herself speak. Whether he wanted to or not, she had reclaimed her place in this world. The tension in the classroom had not fully dissipated. Eyes were still on Alyssa, some filled with surprise, others mixed with admiration, and some, especially Madison, still couldn't accept the fact that the order in this classroom had been completely disrupted in just a few short minutes. But Alyssa no longer cared about that. She had said what needed to be said. She had let the music speak for her, and now, whether anyone acknowledged it or not, she knew she was no longer the outsider they once thought she was. Just as the atmosphere in the room hung uncertainly between praise and confusion, the door to the classroom suddenly opened. Everyone turned their heads as a woman stepped in. Mrs. Collins. She was one of the longtime teachers at Willow Ridge Academy, not only respected by the students, but also by the entire faculty. Her graying hair was neatly tied at the back of her neck, her eyes sharp yet warm, and her posture always upright, as if she carried the immense responsibility of being a true educator. But what made her entrance at this moment even more notable was the way she observed Alyssa from the moment she walked into the room. She had heard the performance. Unlike the others in the room, Mrs. Collins didn't show any surprise. If there was anything in her eyes at that moment, it was certainty, as if she had just found something she had been searching for a long time. She paid no attention to the curious stares of the students. She didn't notice Mr. Grayson's awkward expression or the simmering discontent in Madison's gaze. She just looked at Alyssa, and in a calm but weighty voice, she asked, "Have you ever thought about applying for a music scholarship?" The entire room froze. Alyssa's eyes widened, feeling as if she had misheard. A music scholarship? That was something she had never dared to imagine. She had loved the piano since she was little, spending her childhood quietly sitting in front of the old church piano, letting her fingers explore the keys without anyone to guide her. But no matter how much she longed for it, no matter how many hours she spent practicing alone, that dream had always seemed out of reach. The kids at Willow Ridge Academy weren't like her. They had parents willing to spend tens of thousands of dollars to hire private teachers. They had grand pianos sitting in the middle of their living rooms, prestigious music classes, large stages to perform on from a young age. And she was just a girl with nothing but passion. And in this world, passion was not always enough. She had never dared to think that she could stand alongside those considered musical prodigies, never imagined that someone would see the true value in how she played. But now, the person standing in front of her, a teacher she had always admired from afar, was asking her a question she never thought she would hear. Mrs. Collins didn't take her eyes off Alyssa. There was no hesitation in her gaze. She was truly serious. Not because she wanted to be kind, not because she felt sorry for her, but because she had seen something in Alyssa that no one else had recognized. Next to Alyssa, Madison clenched her fist, her nails digging deep into her palm. She tried to keep her face neutral, but she couldn't hide the tension tightening inside her. She had always been the shining star of this class. She was the one praised by the teachers, the one whose parents hired private tutors for, the one chosen to perform at prestigious school events. She had spent her entire life asserting her position, ensuring that no one could surpass her. And now, right before her, someone she had once considered unworthy of attention was being offered a chance at a music scholarship. Not her, but Alyssa Carter. The anger within Madison flared, but she couldn't do anything. She couldn't speak out against it, couldn't turn to Mrs. Collins and tell her she was wrong, because everything that had just happened proved the opposite. And that drove her crazy. Alyssa still hadn't spoken. She was still too shocked, too surprised by the offer. She looked around the room, seeing faces that had once looked down on her now observing her with a curiosity and admiration she had never received before. She looked at Mr. Grayson, noticing the awkwardness in how he avoided Mrs. Collins' gaze, as if he felt threatened. Because if Alyssa truly had the chance to win the music scholarship, if she really had the opportunity to leave this place and pursue her dream, then his entire perception of talent and worth would be completely upended. She looked down at her hands, her fingers still feeling the lingering echo of the music she had just played. Maybe this wasn't a far-off dream anymore. Maybe this was truly a door opening before her. She took a deep breath, trying to control the emotions rising in her chest, then slowly lifted her head, meeting Mrs. Collins's unwavering gaze. Alyssa paused for a moment, as if even she couldn't believe what she was about to say. I want to try. Mrs. Collins smiled, a satisfied smile, as if she had been expecting this answer all along. But at the back of the classroom, Madison felt like her world was collapsing. Alyssa left the classroom in an odd silence, her steps light, but her heart swirling like a storm inside. She didn't know what she had been expecting, didn't know how long the change would last, but one thing was certain: she was no longer the Alyssa Carter of yesterday. She walked down the hallway, passing groups of students chatting, a few glances sneaking her way, no longer filled with disdain or mockery, but with curiosity, acknowledgement, and perhaps a little admiration. She stepped outside the school gates, a gentle breeze tousling her hair, and only when her foot crossed out of the iron gates of Willow Ridge Academy did she realize her heart was still pounding fiercely in her chest. What had happened today, the music, the applause, Madison's stunned look, Mr. Grayson's rare awkwardness, Mrs. Collins' offer, all felt like a dream. But it was no longer a fleeting, unattainable dream. It was real. Alyssa started to run, not out of fear, not to escape, but because she wanted to get home right away, to tell her mom, to share with her something she had never imagined would happen in her life. Each step brought her closer to the small apartment where she and her mom lived. Her old shoes made soft thuds on the pavement, but she didn't mind. She ran past familiar streets, small grocery shops where her mom often bought food after her shift, alleys she had walked through every day, never imagining she could actually escape this world and reach her dream. And then, when the apartment door appeared before her, when her hand touched the doorknob, tears welled up in her eyes. But these weren't tears of pain, not tears of despair, but tears of hope. The door opened, and standing right before her was her mother, Monica Carter, with tired eyes yet always gentle, with a few strands of silver in her hair but still radiating the warmth of unconditional love. She was still in her nurse's uniform, proof that she had just finished her shift, but when she saw her daughter standing there, eyes red, breath still ragged from running a long distance, worry immediately appeared on her face. "Alyssa? What happened, sweetheart?" Unable to hold back any longer, Alyssa threw herself into her mother's embrace, the familiar warmth enveloping her, and in that moment she knew she had truly done it. She had broken down the invisible wall that had imprisoned her for so many years. She had proven to the world, and more importantly to herself, that she was worthy. She had made them listen to her. Her voice trembled as she spoke the first words, "Mom, I played, and they listened to me." Monica pulled back a little, placing both hands on her daughter's cheeks, her gaze full of love, but also full of questions. "Tell me, sweetheart, what happened?" Alyssa took a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts amidst the emotional wave. She began to tell her about how Mr. Grayson had mocked her, about the expectant looks waiting for her to fail, about how she had almost given up, but then remembered her mom's words and decided to stand up, place her hand on the keys, and play. She told her about how the whole class fell silent, about how Madison lost her smugness, about how Mr. Grayson was flustered and couldn't deny the truth. And finally, she told her about Mrs. Collins, about the music scholarship offer, a door that Alyssa had never thought would open before her. Each word she spoke was like a small flame warming Monica's heart. She listened, said nothing, just silently held her daughter's hand, as if wanting to preserve this moment forever. Then, when Alyssa stopped, when the last of her tears fell, but were no longer of sorrow, Monica gently stroked her daughter's hair, and in a soft but firm voice she said, "You've always been enough, sweetheart. You just needed to believe that." Alyssa stood still. She had heard her mother's encouraging words many times before, but today, hearing those words again, they carried a whole new meaning. Before, she always thought her mother said that just to comfort her. She had always believed her mom just wanted her to not give up on her dreams, even when the world outside had decided she wasn't good enough. But today, she realized something important. Her mom had never doubted her. Her mom had never seen her dream as a mere fantasy. Her mom had never thought she wasn't capable. It was only she who had doubted herself. Alyssa felt like an invisible knot inside her had been undone, a knot that had bound her for so many years. She smiled, a real smile, no longer filled with hesitation or fear. She believed in it. She believed she was worthy. She believed she could do it, and for the first time, she felt like her dream was no longer out of reach. The morning sunlight filtered through the window curtains, casting its glow on Alyssa's small room, where she sat quietly in front of her desk, her eyes fixed on the screen of her old laptop. The words on the screen flickered before her. Willow Ridge Music Scholarship Application, a form she never imagined she would fill out just a few days ago. She placed her hand on the keyboard but stopped. Not because of worry, but because she was trying to fully absorb the moment. A week ago, she never dared to believe she had this opportunity. A week ago, she was still the shy girl sitting in the back row, trying to become invisible to avoid the mocking gazes of Madison and people like her. But now, everything had changed. Her breath was deeper. Her eyes sparkled with a determination she had never seen in herself before. She knew this was just the beginning, that the road ahead would not be easy, that just because she had talent didn't mean everything would come to her easily. But the dream was no longer distant. She was touching it. Even though her confidence had grown, Alyssa couldn't completely shake off the worries within her. She knew that, even if she was chosen for the scholarship program, she would still face countless challenges. At Willow Ridge, most students pursuing music had spent years practicing with private teachers, playing expensive instruments, and performing at prestigious events. And what about her? She had learned the piano on her own, using her ears and hands to figure out each note, borrowing old sheet music from the library, spending late nights in the corner of a church where it was just her and the old piano, the only thing that understood her more than anyone else. How could she compete with them? A thought crossed her mind, the familiar feeling that had held her back for so many years, that maybe she still wasn't good enough. But then she remembered the moment when she placed her hands on the piano keys in class that day. She remembered the absolute silence after the piece, Madison's astonished look, and the moment Mr. Grayson couldn't refute the truth. She had done what no one thought possible. She wasn't just good enough, she had exceeded their expectations, and if she could do it once, she could do it again. She clenched her fists, her eyes bright with a confidence she had never had before. No matter what, she would not back down. She would go all the way. Alyssa began filling out the application. Full name, Alyssa Carter. field of expertise, classical piano. Just writing these words gave her a strange feeling. She had always thought that things like this were for others. The rich kids, the ones who could dedicate all their time to music without worrying about money, the ones whose parents would invest everything for their success. But now she was writing her own name here, not because someone pitied her, not because someone wanted to help her, but because she deserved to be here. She continued to fill out each section, answering questions about why she chose music, how she started playing the piano, and what she believed music had given her. When she reached the last part, where it asked for a short essay on why she deserved the scholarship, Alyssa suddenly stopped, her finger hovering over the keyboard. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She knew the answer had always been there, in her heart, from the first day she touched those piano keys. She opened her eyes and began to write. I was not born with the perfect conditions to pursue music. I never had a teacher to guide me, never owned an expensive piano, or had the opportunity to perform on a big stage. But I have something that nothing can replace, a love for music and the perseverance to never give up on it. I played every day, not because someone told me to, but because I couldn't live without music. I played with my heart, with the hopes and the struggles I've gone through. And when I placed my hands on the keys, I didn't just create sounds. I told my own story. I'm not applying for this scholarship because I want to be treated differently. I'm applying for this scholarship because I believe I have something special to offer, because I believe my music deserves to be heard, and because I know that if I'm given the opportunity, I won't waste it. I'm not a child with a perfect starting point, but I am someone who knows that no matter where my starting point is, I can step onto the stage and make the whole world listen. She read every word, feeling each sentence as if it were a part of herself. No more fear, no more doubt. She only had one certainty: she would do it. She clicked the submit button. The screen displayed the message, "Your application has been successfully submitted." Alyssa stared at the words, feeling something break inside her, not fear, but a door opening before her. She had taken the first step toward her dream. Alyssa walked into the room, closed the door behind her, and sank into the wooden chair next to the old piano. The room was engulfed in silence, only the soft yellow light from the corner ceiling casting a warm glow over everything. This space was so familiar, the place where she had spent countless nights alone, her fingers gliding over the worn piano keys, where her dreams had once soared. But it was also here that she had often questioned whether she was truly good enough. But today, everything was different. Alyssa was no longer the shy girl sitting in the corner of the classroom, no longer the invisible shadow that Madison could easily trample on, no longer someone Mr. Grayson could look down on just because she wasn't born into a wealthy family. She had changed. She was no longer the outsider. She was the one who had stepped up to the piano, silenced the class, and let her talent break down the barriers that others tried to impose on her. The scholarship offer from Mrs. Collins wasn't a miracle. It didn't come because someone wanted to give her a humanitarian chance. It came because she deserved it, and she knew that the road ahead would still be full of challenges. She knew that Madison would still try to bring her down. She knew that even with the scholarship, she would face more talented competitors, people with more opportunities, those who had been ahead of her for years. But now, she was no longer afraid. She placed her hand on the old keys and gently pressed a note. The sound rang out, imperfect, not as rich as the grand piano at Willow Ridge, but to her, it carried a meaning far deeper than any music in the world. It was her voice. A thought passed through her mind, as clear as if someone had just whispered in her ear, Don't let anyone define your worth. People like Mr. Grayson, like Madison, they once thought they could decide who deserved what and who didn't. But they were wrong. They didn't have the right to do that. Because worth doesn't come from fame, from background, or from what others think of you. Worth comes from within you. She took a deep breath and began to play. The melody flowed, slow but steady. The notes intertwined, filling the small room with sound, bursting like a declaration that she would never stop, that she would never let anyone extinguish her dreams again. And if you have talent, let it speak for itself. Alyssa closed her eyes, letting the music carry her away, letting the world fade into the melodies she had spent her life chasing. And this time, she was no longer afraid. Alyssa Carter wasn't born with the perfect circumstances, nor was there a pre-paved path for her to follow. But she chose not to let anyone define her worth, using music to speak for her, proving that talent doesn't belong to any class but to those who are persistent and brave enough to pursue it. Alyssa's story isn't just about a girl who plays the piano. It's the story of resilience, of daring to rise when the world doubts you, of turning ridicule into motivation to shine. What about you? Have you ever been underestimated or had someone try to crush your dreams? What did you do to overcome it? Share your story in the comments below. Who knows, your story might inspire someone. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you stories of persistence, determination, and people who never give up on their dreams. See you in the next video.